Hello, everyone. Welcome to another season of the Inside the Birds pregame show. I'm Jeff Mosher, joined by my Inside the Birds co-host, Adam Kaplan. And back with us, as always, he's the best in the business of tape breakdown, Greg Cosell. Fellas, how we doing? Excited for some football?
I really am. I spent so much time. I have like 70 pages of notes from rewatching so much stuff this summer, because I can watch it differently. But it hit me today that I'm really tired of watching the stuff from last year, and I just can't wait for a real game.
Yeah.
Get some
Yeah,
tape.
so that you
Yeah.
can get 70 more pages of notes.
Right, exactly.
Right,
Right,
right.
right, right.
Well, Adam, I know you've done an NFL training camp tour. You've seen the Eagles a lot, and you're excited also for the dawn of another NFL season.
Can't wait. Yeah, the first game, and look, there's a lot of things that go on. Week one's kind of weird. Expect the unexpected, and the game that we're
Yeah,
going to be breaking down, Jeff, as you know, is not in our country. It's in Spain, at what looks to be a soccer stadium.
It's actually in
Uh,
Brazil,
it's in
but Spain
Brazil.
might be next year.
Brazil. I'm sorry, in Brazil, right? In Brazil, excuse me. But I took a look at several pictures and I like what John Ferrari said, the Eagles assistant GM. It's kind of like the Home Depot Center. The configuration is really
Yeah.
for soccer. They could call it whatever they want, but it looks like that. So Sao Paulo, we're in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. It's going to be nice. It's just interesting, you know. I know fans are not super happy that the game is not at the link, but we'll see what happens. Week one is always interesting.
No,
It
yeah,
always
and
is.
it really is. And it's funny, week one, there's always three or four games that are total head scratchers where you go, how did that happen? Who
Exactly.
expected that? And then the league kind of settles into being what we sort of more expect. Although there's always a couple of teams, either way, teams that win more or lose more that you don't expect throughout the season. But week one is crazy.
I
And
want to ask you
when
something real
guys
quick,
don't
Greg.
play in the preseason, you just don't know.
Right. I want to ask you something off of that. So I was one of the teams that I visited with said to me, and the guy was a personnel director. He said, and he goes, look, if you're watching our team, we actually tackle because tackling is kind of a lost art, particularly early in the season.
Yeah.
It's not great. Now, in your tape study, that's why I want to throw it back to you. In your tape study over the years, just generally, do you see that in the first couple weeks?
Well, I think tackling overall is not what it used to be. I mean, I don't think teams, number one, are allowed to play physically as much as they used to. And whether it's OTAs, whether it's training camp,
Sure.
there's just not as much physical football that's allowed. And tackling, like anything else, must be practiced. So what you see a lot of is guys trying to make bigger hits without proper tackling technique. And, look, I know you guys talk to scouts just like I do, and I watch obviously a ton of tape, but you don't see a lot of guys with great tackling technique these days because
Right.
it's you have to practice it, and you just don't get a chance to practice it.
100%. Well,
Yeah.
you guys set the table very nicely here. Week one is always unexpected, but what we can, or at least what we do expect, is a pretty good game between two teams that people expect to be
Yeah.
pretty good this year. And that's obviously the Eagles beginning their season, as Adam mentioned, in an unfamiliar place, Sao Paulo, Brazil, at Corinthians Arena to take on the Green Bay Packers. This is the first ever NFL game played in Brazil. We're all excited to be back on Inside the Birds pregame show. A little bit of a different format this season. We'll be breaking down the show for an hour, and this show will be released early every game day to make sure you have the most amount of time to get in for the best Eagles breakdown that there is. So welcome to football, and let's get on to this week one matchup. Both teams will start with injuries as we normally do. The beauty of week one is that usually you don't have to spend 10 minutes on injuries compared to week 10, 11, or 12. Both teams come in fairly healthy. The Eagles will be, though, without one of their key, semi-key offseason signings, which is linebacker Devin White. He did not make the trip because of an ankle injury. Adam, that has provoked the question, had he been healthy, what would have been his role, as we've talked all summer long about the interesting rotation going on at linebacker?
Yeah, there's been a lot of conspiracy theories. Where did this injury come from? He wasn't hurt in the preseason, wasn't hurt in training camp. See what happened here. Well, the bottom line is he got hurt in practice. Something happened uh, earlier this week, and by NFL rule, if the player's not going to travel with you, the player has to be listed as out. And in fact, Jeff, because the Eagles left on Wednesday and the final statuses were not due till Thursday, they still had to do it because they flew early.
Right.
So he's not playing. What I find interesting, what the Eagles did, and as much as I've criticized not just the Eagles, but just all teams with these depth charts, these unofficial depth charts, some of them are wrong. I give them credit. What we understood happened. The final couple weeks of training camp, it was really White. It was Devin White, and by the way, he's playing the Mike position, not the weak side, which we thought would happen when they signed him. He's actually playing the Mike in their front. With Nakobe Dean. Those guys are kind of 1 and 2. They list White as the first guy, but quite frankly, Nakobe Dean was the best linebacker they had since the open practice where Dean didn't play well, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
Dean really got himself together and closed really well. And quite frankly, and we know he's going to start in this game, I know that White's making, in fact, his base salary became fully guaranteed this week because he's on the week 1 roster. So he's going to make nearly $5 million this season. You got to play your best guys. That's
right.
just the way it is. Jeff, to answer your question, Dean's the better football player right now. If he plays well this game, I can't see him giving that up.
Yeah, and Craig, that really lends into the bigger picture that we'll probably talk about as the season goes on. Adam talked about, the best linebackers are going to play, and I think we have a situation that we'll get into more in a little bit. But just as you look at it, big picture, I don't think it's crystal clear yet who the best Eagles linebackers really are. We have Zach Bond trying it out, a new position full time for the first time. You have Nakobe Dean coming back from injury. You have a Jeremiah Trotter Jr. who on our platform, you mentioned once you felt his tape in college was better than Nakobe Dean's college tape.
I did, but from what I understand, and I was not at training camp, so I don't know exactly what happened. But from what I understand, Trotter, the sense is he's not quite ready to play significant snaps at stack backer. He'll be a special teams player, and from what I understand, he's going to be very good at that. But he's not quite ready, and that's why certainly Dean, and I heard the same thing, that Adam was talking about, that Dean really played well in recent weeks in training camp, and that he's clearly the guy that's going to play meaningful most of the snaps at linebacker come tomorrow night, come Friday night.
Gotcha. And now the only other question mark, I guess, for the Eagles' injury concern was Isaiah Rodgers, who's been limited at practice with a hand. He's not out of the game. He was just limited at practice. And I think, Adam, he's been dealing with the hand for a little bit. So we'll see what Vic Fangio decides to do with his secondary when he comes out in a base defense and a nickel defense. If Isaiah Rodgers is involved in one, the other, both, none, we'll see.
Jeff, what's interesting about Vic Fangio and this revamped defensive staff? Almost all of the coaches are new. I went to, I think, 12 practices in training camp. Generally, we could all test to it. We've all been in practices over the years that we've covered the league. Usually, you get a pretty good feel of what the defense is going to look like. We know what Vic runs, right? We know coverage-wise, odd man front, all that, 2 inside backers, the 5-man front, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But what I don't know is what you just mentioned on the back end. The way that they ended training camp is Mitchell, when they're in with 2 corners, Mitchell is an outside corner. And nickel, Mitchell was going inside and Rodgers was coming in just like he did in Indy with Kenny Moore.
Yep.
So I'm assuming that's going to happen. But here's the other question. And we saw big nickel in training camp. Vic ran some of that in Denver. Maddox now is moved exclusively to safety. So will he be a slot corner? Is it going to be Mitchell going forward? And Cooper DeJean. Yep, Jeff, and I'll throw it back to you. DeJean's role is not really set. We don't know exactly where he's going to line up. We think he's going to be a nickel, but if he is, then what about Quinion in nickel? So that's a conundrum to try to figure this thing out going forward.
Certainly. And we'll discuss that, certainly as the season goes on, as Cooper DeJean gets himself a little more game ready. And even in this show, when we start to talk about defensive structure and what that might look like. As for injuries with the Packers, I don't believe anybody is out of the game, and especially any key starters. They have a couple of guys who are on the injury report nursing injuries. Romeo Doubs, their wide receiver, with a hand. Edgerrin Cooper, their rookie, with a hip. Marshawn Lloyd, backup running back, was dealing with a hamstring. Tucker Kraft, their tight end, a back. And then cornerback Carrington Valentine and a backup running back, third string running back, Emmanuel Wilson, also dealing with some bumps and bruises there. Of all the names of those guys, Adam, Edgerrin Cooper kind of jumps out. Well, Romeo Doubs too, because he's a starting receiver, but Edge Cooper was this, lightning linebacker. What was your understanding of his role that could be in this game if he plays?
I'm kind of stunned by this, but I know it's early. It doesn't mean he won't be starting for a lot. But to end training camp, former Eagle, not great, Eric Wilson was starting. He was one of the starting linebackers. Hey, it is what it is. Remember, they're changing their scheme. We'll talk more about that. Jeff Hafley's going to run a 43, and they've run a 43, and I don't know how long. So right now, Cooper's not starting. Without the injury, he wasn't starting. Doesn't mean he won't take over. Isaiah McDuffie is one of their starting backers. Quay Walker is a first rounder 2 years ago, and 22 is a starter. And Eric Wilson's the other starting outside backer. Again, they're starting three backers, off the ball linebackers. So it's kind of interesting. Eric Wilson's a guy that when he was in Philly, Jeff, you know this, he was very light. It didn't happen for him. He's bounced around, but I give the guy credit. Apparently, from what I understand, he had a pretty good training camp.
Yeah, I mean, Greg, when I look at that, I think just from remembering him with the Eagles, I would think Eric Wilson's on the field if they're in a true base 4-3 early. If he's in on nickel, well, that's an area maybe the Eagles will look to exploit. Obviously, Edge Cooper is a guy you also, though, liked coming out of Texas A&M, I believe, this year, right?
Texas A&M, yeah. And my sense is he probably wouldn't play in the nickel. I think it would be Walker and McDuffie, but I guess we don't know that for sure, but that would be my sense.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Other than that, team's pretty healthy. Teams had very similar off seasons. They both went out and got a running back. The Eagles got Saquon Barkley. The Packers got Josh Jacobs, right? They both went out and got a pretty good safeties. The Eagles brought back CJ Gardner-Johnson, and the Packers signed Xavier McKinney. So that's four players who are going to be pretty instrumental to this team's successes or lack thereof going into 2024. Why don't we start looking at the Eagles offense and how it's going to play against this new Packers defense? As Adam mentioned, they have a new defensive coordinator. We'll get into his scheme. His name is Jeff Hafley. He was the head coach of Boston College. The Eagles have some newness themselves on offense, Greg, with Kellen Moore, now the offensive coordinator. Give us the book on Kellen Moore and what he does offensively that he should bring to this Eagles offense.
Well, it's funny. I mean, obviously I've seen him through the years, but I also talked to a bunch of coaches about him. And the sense I got, and this may not be profound, and you could probably say this about a lot of coaches, but I was told that he'll do multiple things. In other words, he's not just a guy that does one thing and you say, hey, foundationally, this is exactly what Kellen Moore does, and this is what he's going to do. I think in an ideal world, he'd like to play with three wide receivers. And I think that's one reason they made the deal for Jahan Dotson, because they just did not feel like they had a third wide receiver worthy of getting significant snaps. And that's why that deal became so critical. And obviously he was a former first-round pick. I guarantee that there were a lot of teams that had him rated highly coming out of Penn State, as I did as well. I don't know what happened in Washington. He had a very good rookie season where it looked as if he'd become a quality receiver. I don't know what happened with the new coaching staff. I don't know if Adam has any information about that, but obviously it wasn't working out there. But I think Kellen Moore would like to be very multiple with his formations out of three wide receivers. I think he'd like to use more motion than we've seen from the Eagles in recent years. I think you'll see a lot more of that. That doesn't mean there won't be 12 personnel, but I think right now, don't they only have 2 tight ends on the roster that will be active for the game? So that doesn't mean there won't be snaps of 12 personnel, but I don't think foundationally Kellen Moore sees that as important as playing out of 11 personnel.
Adam, why don't you talk about what we've mentioned on Inside the Birds podcast a few times since the trade for Jahan Dotson on why Washington felt like it should move on?
Yeah, so it was kind of a situation where pretty early in their offseason, this staff, whether it's the front office or coaching staff or both, got down on Dotson. And they inherited him. He was not drafted by Adam Peters, the new general manager. He wasn't with Dan Quinn and this new staff. And Olamide Zaccheaus is a guy that pretty much was going to play over him. That sounds crazy, but that's kind of where they were at. Dotson just did not perform well. I could tell being there. The vibe was not good for him. He's a good person off the field. It's nothing off the field. It's on the field. Gets knocked for playing too finesse, not physical. And I just got the feeling that I know they were shopping him. They didn't want him. They weren't going to cut him. But Jeff, to answer your question, sometimes guys move on, and you're somewhere where they want you. And the Eagles clearly wanted him, as Greg said. They didn't have a third receiver. He's going to be that. He'll probably more back up Devontae Smith and AJ Brown. But the knock on him is not the most physical guy. Doesn't always win routes when he should win, and that shows up on the field, unfortunately.
You know, and it's funny because I remember, and Jeff, obviously as a Penn Stater, you probably remember him very well. But I thought one of his really good traits, watching him coming out of college, given his size, he's not a big kid, was that he was really competitive and he played with a tenacious nature. And so I don't know what happened. I mean, with the kid personally, I can't speak to that, but that was one of his really positive traits coming out of Penn State.
Yes, and he also caught nearly everything thrown at him.
Yeah, I know, and he made tough catches.
So to watch him struggle to catch the ball, even with Washington,
yeah,
is certainly was a head scratcher.
Yep. So we'll see. I mean, look, we know not every first round pick makes it, so we'll see. But the Eagles, again, you know what happens when teams trade like that for a player, as you guys both know, is that somebody in the Eagles front office, you know, whether a scout, whether it's, you know, a personnel guy, really liked him coming out of Penn State, and he became available, and they want to go get him because they feel then that they can make him into what they think he can be.
Right. Now, the reality of what he has been, Greg, and I think that when he came over to the Eagles, people automatically thought, oh, number 3 slot receiver. The Eagles were struggling with a slot receiver, right? And that's a natural fit. But for those who don't realize, I think 60% or more of Jahan Dotson's career snaps with Washington over 2 years came from the outside. So he has not been someone who's been a natural slot receiver. And then you also juxtapose that, Greg, with Kellen Moore is kind of known for using some of his better, most talented receivers in the slot, going back to CeeDee Lamb in Dallas and last year with Keenan Allen. You've got a weird juxtaposition here. I mean, Jahan Dotson just got here, still has to learn the offense, hasn't really been a slot receiver. It does make me wonder, do we see more of an A.J. Brown or a Devontae Smith?
Well, that's why I mentioned the point about formation variation and the multiplicity of formations that Kellen Moore is going to do. I mean, he could, you know, a lot of people might forget that until about game 7 of his college career, A.J. Brown was a pure slot receiver in college. So he's played there. Devonta Smith can line up anywhere. We know Dotson can, assuming he's the guy. That's what they got him for. So I don't think this is going to be one of those situations where they line up basically in one spot. You know, I think that's one of the things about Kellen Moore that we will see is that he will move receivers around.
Yeah. It's probably an interesting meeting room, Adam, because, you know, we've got some intel that the Eagles really don't want to play Devontae Smith in the slot too much, given his size. They don't want him as lead blockers on screens. You know, he's the Slim Reaper. He's not necessarily built the same way Keenan Allen and CeeDee Lamb are. And the same thing you can say for A.J. Brown as far as having a history with injury, trying to make sure the knee is right. So it'll be I think this is the most fascinating first, you know, not test for Kellen Moore, but first observation of what he does is how he fills that inside receiver role. And to your point, you've mentioned this, it could be that a rotating position that also includes a second tight end.
Yeah. We've talked about that with Calcaterra. By the way, Britton Covey had a phenomenal training camp. He obviously could play the slot. That's his position. They tried him on the outside. He's just very small. But the thing that they've got to get going here is Dotson's just got to win. That third receiver, you might remember Cole Beasley with Dallas, who was phenomenal under Kellen. Everywhere he's been, he's had to have somebody who could play inside to be a factor.
Yep.
And I would tell you, Devontae Smith's numbers inside are phenomenal, like really good when he plays inside. So Greg's right. You could just keep rotating guys. We don't want to overstate having a third receiver, but Jeff, what was it story John T. Filippo told us about the third receiver?
You're only as good as your third receiver, says Troy Aikman.
Yeah, Troy told him that in a production meeting. So you know what? You got to have one. And right now, Dotson is it.
Just like you have to have a third corner. A lot of defensive coaches feel you're only as good in your sub packages as your third corner, you know.
Definitely. There you go.
No, that's the game in many ways now.
Yeah. Last year being a great example. Not that the Eagles had a great number 2 corner either, but man, they were really picked on the interior with their rotating number of slot cornerbacks. Let's talk about a really interesting matchup. The one I find fascinating is really the trench battle here. You have an Eagles offensive line that historically has been dominant, has three really excellent players, one at left tackle, one at right tackle, one at left guard, but is also indoctrinating for the first time in a while two new starters. And for the first time in over a decade, a new center with Cam Jurgens and a new right guard in Mekhi Becton, who may not necessarily have won that job more than fell into it without a real competitor. Tyler Steen was banged up for a lot of camp. And then, Greg, you look at the other side, this Packers defensive front, a little bit light, but they've got some good. I mean, Kenny Clark is good. Preston Smith, Rashawn Gary, Luke Van Ness is a guy who's going to enter year 2. So how do you see that matchup, and what are the strengths of the Packers front line compared to what the Eagles have up front?
I think it's a really good defensive front. And you made a point, I think it's important to reiterate that they're making a transition essentially from what they were in the past, which was much more of a 3-4/5-2. And now with Hafley, they're going to be a 4-down front. That's his background. That's what they're going to do. And, if you say that the starters are Gary and Preston Smith on the edge and Slayton and Clark inside, that's really good. But even guys who are backups, I remember last year watching Carl Brooks, who was a rookie, I think at a Bowling Green, and I did not do him coming out. And he flashed every game. They still have then 2 first-round picks. They have Devonta Wyatt from Georgia, who was a first-round pick. They've got Van Ness, who you mentioned. Even Kingsley Enagbare is a good player. So this is a really deep defensive front with a lot of really good players. So, and that's the way they'll play. They're going to be a 4-down front.
It'll be to me, I think it'll be interesting, Adam, to see what they do with Van Ness year 2. A guy who has, the size of an edge rusher, but the athleticism to maybe move inside in nickel.
Yep.
And if you're looking at Mekhi Becton and you're looking at Cam Jurgens and saying, I want to test these guys in pass pro, I want to see how good they work together. I want to see the operations in a stadium that could be loud and have half Packers fans. I might want to put Van Ness in the middle there and see if I can move him around a little bit for mismatches.
Yeah, in fact, I think that's going to happen. Van Ness, when they play nickel, him to play inside a tackle. But one thing I do want to mention when you look at this Packers situation, and one of the reasons why they moved on from Joe Barry is they really were an underachieving defense. I don't doubt that they're talented, but for whatever reason, they weren't as good as they should be. In fact, I think, Greg, you and I have been talking about this issue with their defense for years. For some reason, they're not quite as good as they should be, despite all this talent. First-round picks.
Yeah.
Guys are very gifted, and they just don't play up to that level for whatever reason. But, I mean, heck, as Greg said, they're like 8 deep, if not more, on their D-line, but they don't, whatever happens, Jeff, individually, they just don't get it together all the time.
That's why they wanted a scheme change. Yeah, very often when that's the case, you go with a scheme change.
Yeah, and that's what they did here.
Yeah, and Hafley is going to play. I mean, keep in mind, Hafley's got a really interesting background. He's been in the league before, as you guys both know, but fans may not know because they might think of him as being at BC. Now, he also coached at Ohio State for a year, and that's where he really played a lot of that 4-down, cover one centric defense that Ryan Day wanted to keep, from the Urban Meyer days. So, that's a lot of his background. He's transitioned a bit to playing more quarters because the league has as well. But he also has some really intriguing pressure concepts. You're going to see this team pressure more than the Packers did last year. And again, that's part of the scheme change. But they've got really good players. Even beyond the front, you look at their secondary. I mean, Stokes is a first-round pick. Jari Alexander is a first-round pick. McKinney was a first-round pick, I believe. I mean, even if Javon Bullard starts at safety, he's a second-round pick. I mean, this is a team with a lot of high pedigree picks.
Absolutely. You mentioned that the book on Jeff Hafley at BC was aggressive defensive coordinator, a lot of cover 1, cover 3, in that mold. And I can't help but think, the transition to incorporating more quarters might be his best friend in the game tonight. I mean, if you go back a couple of years ago, the Detroit Lions and Aaron Glenn, he wanted to bring the house. He wanted to play one safety high, and Jalen Hurts ate him up with A.J. Brown, and they passed the ball all over that day, 35.
Well, they didn't have good enough corners. Obviously, that's what it comes down to. I spoke to a number of coaches this offseason, defensive coaches, and the first thing they say when you talk about pressure is they say, well, you got to cover on the back end, And they have 2 first-round picks playing outside corner. They've got Stokes and Alexander, and Alexander's, unfortunately for the Packers, has had health issues the last number of years. But obviously, they're going to start, as had Stokes. They're both going to start the season healthy. So we'll see how that goes. But keep in mind that there's also a Rex Ryan element and a Mike Pettin element to Hafley's background. So there's a lot of pressure packages here. He's a student of all those pressure schemes. So you're going to see not only the 4-man pass rush, but you're going to see some pretty intricate pressure schemes as well.
Well, Adam, that brings us to a big conversation about this offense this year and having an answer to pressure, and not just hot routes, but a guy that the Eagles went out and think can be a big response, and that's Saquon Barkley catching passes out of the backfield. I have a feeling on Inside the Birds post-game show tonight, you and I will be talking about whether or not the Eagles finally are going to start throwing the ball to their running back.
Yeah, because as you and I have talked about before, in the 23 training camp, you and I were there, and we were blown away by how many checkdowns that Hurts was having. Also, getting Swift involved downfield a bunch, and then it didn't happen in the regular season. Now, Jalen did not the blitz numbers were not good for him last year. He struggled with it for whatever the reason. It just happened. So the hope is now that he'll get a clearer picture, get rid of the football. Now, Oryx Stokes, I do want to mention, and Greg mentioned his injury history. This is pretty bad the last 2 years. He's missed 22 games over the last 2 years. It's a lot of football he's missed. They're not very deep at corner at all. As we've talked about, Kellen wants to run 11 personnel. In fact, I know for a fact he'd like to run 10 if he can. As someone very close to him told me, that's in his background.
Yeah.
So we might learn a little bit about Johnny Wilson. It's not a guy we probably will talk a lot about this season. Now, Jeff, as you astutely pointed out several weeks ago from what you had heard, Johnny Wilson's a really good blocker. That does matter. If the coaches trust him, he'll be out there. He's also over 6'6". So this is fascinating. On Greg's point, we're going to learn very early in this game. Yes, Barkley's going to be involved, sure, at catching the football and running it. But how much do they trust the backup receivers? How much does Dotson play? Do they play any 10? Also, does Covey play? Does he rotate with Dotson? And do they feel like they could beat those Packer corners?
2 quick points, Jeff, if I could. Their 2 backup corners have played a lot of snaps. Now, obviously, they're backups, but Carrington Valentine and Corey Ballentine have played snaps in this league. So it's not as if they have backup corners who have not played at all. So they have played. And the second point is, very often teams blitz, not necessarily to sack the quarterback, but to keep the back end pass protection. Okay, we're talking about Barkley as a receiver. I mean, you can almost go back, and I just thought of this while Adam was speaking. Believe me, I didn't plan this. It just popped into my head. But I remember years ago with the big matchups between the Patriots and the Colts, when Bill Belichick used to blitz just to keep Edgerrin James into pass protect because he was such a great receiver. It wasn't done necessarily to sack Peyton Manning, but they just did not want Edgerrin James, who was such a good receiver, to be a primary route runner in the concept of their passing game.
Right.
And so, obviously that's different when it's 1st and 10 or normal down and distance situations. But when it's 3rd down, maybe 3rd and 7, sometimes teams blitz. And I think you'll see this from Jeff Hafley, to blitz to keep the back in. And therefore Barkley just, and fans might say, well, how you have to throw it to Barkley? Well, you gotta protect first, because you don't have a pass game if you can't protect.
Think protection first, right?
Yeah.
And that'll be a big test for something we've talked about. Ever since the Eagles signed Barkley, it felt like there are people who are advocating for Saquon Barkley as an excellent pass protector and excellent blitz protection. But, Adam and I spoke
and that's fine. That's good.
But Adam and I spoke to people who said that it's not as good as you would think.
Right. And I would agree with that.
I think people assume that because he's a big, strong guy. But
right. And even if he is, but the point is, if he has to do that, he's not a receiver.
Right. Absolutely. Another really interesting point off what you just said, Greg. I know that recently some headlines were made about an anonymous coach saying that the book out on Jalen Hurts is you zero blitz him and he's going to make a mistake. He's going to be indecisive. That's now the elixir. And I've seen people respond, well, now that Kellen Moore's the offensive coordinator, they're going to have outlets. They're going to have responses. And I always like to say, hey, look, just because you have a response to a 3rd and 8 blitz doesn't mean you're getting 1st down. A lot of times, to your point, Greg, on why you blitz, use zero blitz because the quarterback has to throw it immediately. If he has to throw it immediately on 3rd and 8 and only gets 5 yards, the defense still won. So even
Right.
if they didn't sack or even if they didn't get a turnover.
Yeah, and a couple of points there. No one zero blitzes 15 times in a game.
Exactly,
You know,
that too.
so it becomes a very selective thing. And normally quarterbacks, and Jalen will see it. I mean, he's a veteran quarterback. Normally you can see that. Now, sure, do teams disguise it? Of course they do. And zero blitz has become much more multiple than it was years ago. So teams do a lot more in the secondary. Sometimes zero blitz is not pure man. Sometimes it's almost like a zone match on the back end. You know, teams have become, look, it's everything is cyclical, everything evolves, and coaches, coaches are pretty smart. So, obviously your point's a good one. I think that they're very aware of that, and there's going to be ways that he's been taught and coached by Kellen Moore and by others on the offensive staff in terms of what he sees and where to go with the football. But the bottom line is what I said is you still have to protect, and that's critical. So what a lot of teams do as well is they show pressure and they force the offense to have to protect. Then they drop out and they have 7 in coverage. And then the offense keeps 2 guys in to protect, a back and a tight end. And you end up with 3 receivers running routes against 7 in coverage. And football is a numbers game in many ways. And the defense wins that very often before the snap of the ball.
Definitely. All right. So let's move on from talking about the Eagles offense versus the Packers defense. We'll switch sides now, talk about the Eagles defense against the Packers offense. Before we do that, I'm not sure if I mentioned at the start of the show, Eagles are 2.5-point favorites in this game against the Packers, which illustrates how close that the odds makers think this is going to be. And I guess what they're saying is on a neutral field. Well, this is a neutral field, 2.5 points. So if it were, if it were in Philadelphia, you would probably see Eagles as a small favorite. If it were in Green Bay, you'd probably see the Packers as a small favorite. Just an interest. I always think a 2.5-point line at a neutral field is pretty interesting.
You know what's interesting on that? It opened in May, right when the schedule came out. Eagles were either 4, 4.5. It got down to 1, 1.5. Now it's 2, 2.5, depending on what book you look like. Obviously, money, depending on which side. Depending on what's heavy, the lines makers are going to move it, so the books don't lose money. But overall, yeah, I think it's the belief is it's a pretty even matchup. And just to add a couple injury notes here. So Marshawn Lloyd's still dealing with his hamstring injury, which he's had since early August.
Wow.
Dylan's out for the season with the neck injury. He will not play. So if Lloyd doesn't play, and you mentioned, Jeff, the kid Wilson, he's questionable. He's had a hip issue. By the way, when you got a hip issue, you got to be able to block also. If you're in, you got to be able to power through. You're running back. That's a concern. Tucker Kraft got added midweek with a back injury. That's a concern. Who, by the way, he had the lacerated kidney last year. Dobbs has been cleared to play. So is Cooper. We could add that. And Greg mentioned Carrington Valentine, one of the backup corners. He's been cleared from the hamstring. He'll be able to play.
Yeah. So what I take from that, Adam, is if you have Josh Jacobs on your fantasy team, and you're deciding whether or not to start him or somebody else in the flex, start him. He's going to touch the ball a whole lot theoretically, without anybody really there to back him up.
Yeah, and the thing is with I know we're switching sides of the ball, but I do want to mention one thing though, in terms of the Eagles defense. We'll see how well they cover, because there were some times, Jeff, they were not covering well at all, the linebackers, which has been a problem for a while. And it's you mentioned at the top that one of their backers will be out, Devin White, and I'm interested to see what Matt LaFleur's got cooked up here.
I am interested too. You know what I'm also interested to see as we switch sides and talk about the Eagles defense? What does Vic Fangio have cooked up, especially based on things that we saw at training camp? I am not surprised. I don't think anybody on this panel is, that at training camp, we saw a lot of inside linebackers rushing the passer. Okay. That is a staple. The sim pressures, as we've seen around the league, is a staple of a Vic Fangio defense. What I would love to see, and I'm really fascinated, when they do that, who's going to be dropping into coverage from the edges? And in general, Greg, this is the first time in a long time Adam and I have talked about, we really don't know what the 4-man rush is. Usually with the Eagles, it's pretty, the 4-man rush, and you probably know the 2 guys who are going to come in the second string 4-man rush. This year, yes, Bryce Hall will be part of it. Yes, or Bryce Huff. Yes, Jalen Carter. But you've got Nolan Smith. You've got who's the other edge rusher whose name I'm forgetting right now, who really fell off at the end of last year.
Sweaty.
Yeah, Josh Sweat. You got Nolan Smith, you got Josh Sweat, you got Milton Williams, you've got Moro Jomo. When you look at this team, it's not as certain as it's been in the past.
No, just one quick point, just so people know what a sim pressure is, Jeff.
Sure.
A sim pressure is a four-man rush where a second-level defender is a rusher and a first-level D lineman drops out. So it's a four-man rush.
Right.
So that's it. So it's not, you're not bringing an extra player, but you're bringing someone from the second level. And
right. I call it blitz light, Greg. You're not really blitzing, but you're bringing somebody late and dropping somebody late usually.
You're ultimately trying to get a matchup of a second level rusher on a back. That's what you're trying to get.
Right.
But anyway, so getting to your point, I loved your point about the stack backers, because Zach Bond, going back to his days at Wisconsin, which is an edge pass rusher, okay, and a good one. And then when he played in New Orleans, he only played in their base defense when they went 4-3. And his large percentage of snaps when he played in New Orleans, he played on the ball, not off the ball. So this is really a new position for him. So as Adam said about what Matt LaFleur has cooked up, that'll be very interesting to see how they attack Zach Bond in the pass game. And I'm curious to see, too, how they attack Nakobe Dean in the pass game, because Nakobe Dean, despite his size, is really at his best as a downhill player. So it'll be interesting to see, and Matt LaFleur, obviously, with the Shanahan background, and I mean, he's going to attack these linebackers. Now, I don't want to sit here and say that means it's going to work and they're going to, have 500 yards. We don't know anything about how the game's going to play out, but there's no question that's one area he's looking at to attack.
And Jeff, let me add this, that Isaiah Rodgers will not play with a hand injury. So we could just update that. So right now, again, we know that Mitchell and Bass.
Kelee Ringo is going to start outside with Darius Slay.
So you think it'll be okay. So you think that's what they'll do.
I personally believe that based on, look, I thought Kelee Ringo, look, you said you were at 12 practices. I wasn't at practice, but I thought he played extremely well in the games.
All right, just so you know, Ringo was not, it was Mitchell the entire camp, just about the entire camp was an outside corner.
And then in the games, he played a lot of slot.
Right. No, I understand that, but I
think you're going to see both Mitchell and Cooper DeJean play in the slot in this game.
Yeah, if DeJean plays, we'll see. But the way that they were doing it to close training camp, it was Slay and Mitchell on the outside and nickel. Mitchell went inside, and then Rodgers came outside. So now, obviously, Ringo moves up. He's one of the top three corners. Now, maybe when they go nickel, Ringo's outside, obviously, and then Mitchell's inside without Rodgers. So this Jeff, and I know, and Fangio is right. You and I talked about this on our one of our shows. Vic's right. They're a big, balanced 11-12 attack with personnel 3 receivers versus 2. They do a lot of it, but they're super deep at receiver, Jeff. They're also deep at tight end.
Yeah.
Without Rodgers, Jeff, and I know Rodgers is a smaller player, but he's very fast and he's been a good story in training camp. That's not good when you're not having one of your top corners. And we didn't know Rodgers would be one of their top corners in the training camp when it started, but he certainly did close training camp as an important guy.
Yeah, I don't know how much base defense the Eagles were planning on playing, even if the Packers came out in 12 personnel with Musgrave and Kraft, which normally you would answer with a base defense, those guys can catch the ball pretty well. So I think we'll see tonight. Does Vic Fangio just want to stay in nickel, even without Rodgers, and play Quinyon Mitchell at nickelback and Kelee Ringo outside because that's what he's most comfortable with? Or will he respond to 12 personnel with base and then just have Mitchell outside and Slay outside? I think how much Cooper DeJean plays, if he plays at all, will be also really interesting because Greg, he's only been back at practice for about, you could say 2.5 weeks, but there were several days off in between because they had day off before a game, day off after a game. He only got into one game. I wonder how much his readiness will impact his ability to play.
By the way, I don't mean he's going to play 50 snaps.
Of course.
But I think he's going to play. And I think right now he's a nickel player. He's going to play
that's
inside.
Where he practiced at. Absolutely.
They see him down the road as a safety, but he's not ready to do that yet.
So obviously Matt LaFleur is a really good play caller, and he knows this is a new look Eagles secondary. And Greg, let's talk about the diversity then of receivers that the Packers have to play with, because they are not your typical, that's your X, that's your Y, that's your Z. They've got guys who can cause mismatches everywhere.
They got a lot. I mean, I watched a ton of their offense the past game, because I wanted to re-look at Jordan Love because, during the season, I can't watch a quarterback 250 dropbacks in a row. I can't do that during the season because I'm doing week to week, and I have to watch as much as possible. But in the off season, I can do that. So it's funny, the two receivers that really stood out to me watching, 250, 300 Love dropbacks were Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks. And, again, they have a lot of them. So I'm not sitting here saying that these guys are, going to end up with 90 catches. We don't know how all that's going to play out because I really like Romeo Doubs as well. And I think Christian Watson, if he can stay healthy, he may not be a true volume guy, but obviously he brings that vertical dimension to an offense. But Wicks and Reed really stood out to me. And Jordan Love, I mean, we'll get to him in a second, but he improved dramatically. But this is a team, we know Matt LaFleur. He's going to want to run the ball. You're not going to see Josh Jacobs with 8 carries. He wants to run the football. And look, last year the focus was all on Love, deservedly so. But in that stretch where they played really well toward the end of the season, there were 5 games in a row where Aaron Jones had more than 20 carries. So this is not a case where it's just let's toss it all over the yard. They want to run the football.
So that brings into question, I already asked about the front 4, but I think we've also got to see how this new front 5, assuming that there's a 5-man front on rundowns, performs. Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis. The big story of the offseason, Adam, was will these guys be conditioned enough to play? And God bless Vic Fangio for his candor and his honesty, because even in as recently as a couple of days ago, he still is not telling you that he's 100% sure that Carter and Davis can play the type of snaps that they're going to need to be able to play, which is a little bit of a red flag.
Well, yeah, this condition thing that Greg is interesting because, and also the new D-line coach who came from Seattle mentioned the same thing. He talked about the conditioning, which is odd. We were not expecting that. So Clint Hurt, by the way, who's terrific. So look, we know it's Williams, Davis, and Carter. Ojomo's been a good story. I know Greg has a lot of information on him. I know Greg really liked him.
I really liked him coming out of Texas.
Yeah. And then Thomas Booker has been one of the great stories of training camp.
And see, to me, that's one reason why Thomas Booker's on the roster, because they don't feel clearly, as you guys are discussing, that Davis and Carter are ready to play the number of snaps that in an ideal world they would want them to play. Keep in mind, Fangio had Christian Wilkins last year. He played 60 snaps a game. They probably don't feel that Davis and Carter has all world ability, but you got to be on the field. So they probably don't feel like both guys are ready to do that. So Booker is someone who's really stout inside. He's not a pass rusher, but he's really stout inside, and I'm sure that's why he made the team. And by the way, I don't know if he's going to play. I assume he'll be active. Maybe you guys have more information. But I remember Byron Young coming out of Alabama, and I thought he was a really interesting player because he's multi-positional, as a lot of their defensive linemen are. Milton Williams is multi-positional. Moro Ojomo is multi-positional. So Graham has become multi-positional in his later years. So, I think that's clearly important.
I think that there's no question, guys, that the reason why Booker and then this late addition of Byron Young are because those guys could see some decent amount of playing time.
Yeah.
And obviously you were impressed with what you saw from Booker, but more so than even Moro Ojomo, I think those guys can step in and play versatile positions and alignments.
Yes.
I look at Ojomo as a guy who's you're going to rush the passer with him, 3 technique. I mean, I'm not saying he's bad against the run, but I think those other two are there to equip them in run defense.
Tell you what, I'm going to tell you, Jeff, I don't put a lot of stock in preseason in terms of like schemes and tactics at all.
Yeah.
But you can look at individual players. And yeah, we know sometimes they're playing against guys who are not starters, but you can still look at traits and attributes.
Sure.
And I tell you, Ojomo had a number of snaps in the preseason with just physical prowess where he showed really good contact force and he moved people. So, again, I think I'm not going to sit here and tell you Moro Ojomo is going to be a superstar, but I think that with development, he can be a solid 2-way D lineman where he can play the run effectively and give you some pass rush. Like I said, I'm not saying he's going to get 15 sacks, down the road, but I think he has the ability to do both. And he's one of those guys as we start the season that really intrigues me to see how the season plays out for him. And obviously they want Davis and Carter to be the 2 interior players that get the large majority of snaps. But if they're already talking about conditioning issues, that's not likely to get a whole lot better, because during the season, you're not having hard practices.
Right. No, that's true. That's a great point. And it is also valid that last year, Jordan Davis was in way better shape to start the season. And to your point, Greg, as the season went on, is when he started to lose that shape and conditioning.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Howie Roseman would admit freely, and he even said this when he drafted him, that if he's not rushing the quarterback by year 3, then it's not a great pick. Now, I don't think any of us think Jordan Davis is a big time sack guy. He's not, he's not going to get, 14, 15, 16 sacks. But I think at this point in time, you expect Davis to be able to play on 3rd and long and be a factor as an inside rusher. It's not all about sacks. I can tell you that from watching tape for so many years. It's not, hell, if he doesn't get 12 sacks, he's no good. But he's got to be some kind of force as an inside rusher on 3rd down.
Answer my questions real quick. Yes or no? Does Dexter Lawrence play on 3rd down for the Giants?
Yes.
Does Christian Wilkins play on 3rd down? Well, did he for the Dolphins and probably will for the Raiders? There you go. There's no question he has to be that to be considered as
okay. I want to add this. I didn't. I mean, maybe other reporters who were there saw it. I'm not saying he didn't play on 3rd down, but he has not been a factor on 3rd down in terms of a pass rush. It's just not his game. He manhandled, we how big he is and strong he is, and he's in the best shape of his career. But as a pass rusher, it's just not there yet. Now, maybe the bell goes off here tonight or Friday night here against the Packers, and maybe he shows something we haven't seen. I agree with Greg Ojomo. I did not see him a lot in training camp last year. I watched him a lot this year. I was wowed. Jeff, he was playing the 3. They moved him at the 4-eye. He was terrific. This is a good story. Now,
Booker's not a pass rusher.
No, he's not. He's also not he's got good size. He's got some get off. But what they like about him is he could play the nose in other D-tackle positions.
He can.
And let me ask you this question we'll leave why the Raiders got rid of him, why they cut him after 1 year, which is kind of odd, but we'll leave the reasons why. Let's stick, Greg, to your tape study at Alabama. What did you like about Byron Young?
I'm trying to, I just remember liking him. I'm going to pull out my notes. What year did he come out?
Last year. Yeah.
So he was.
Remember, there were 2 Byron Youngs. There was him from Alabama and the other one.
So he was in the 2023 draft, right?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to tell you right now. So there's Byron Young from Alabama and there's Byron Young from Tennessee, right?
Yes, who had a wonderful rookie year for the Rams last year as a 3rd round pick, I believe he was, or a 5th round? No, 3rd round pick. Yeah.
You're talking about which Byron Young?
The other one for the Rams, who had a nice rookie year.
University of Tennessee.
He was an outside, So I made I pulled out my notes. I said that he played multiple positions along Alabama's defensive front in both 21 and 22. But my sense is the high percentage of NFL teams will see him as a D tackle, playing both 3 technique and 1 technique and even fronts, but also capable of lining up inside at 5 technique and 4-eye and 5-man fronts. And I'm sure that's one reason why the Eagles signed him, because he can do both. I said the more I watched Young, the more I liked him in transitioning effectively to the next level with a desirable combination of positional versatility and strong traits, both as a run defender and developing as a pass rusher. So I kind of liked him. I thought he was a strong prospect who's just scratching the surface of what he can be. Now, again, that doesn't make me right, and it doesn't mean it'll all develop. But I thought he had the chance to be a quality player in the NFL. Certainly a rotational player for sure.
Absolutely. All right. So again, this goes back to me. As much as they've remade the secondary, and that's going to be a big focus tonight, especially against this Packers receiving core, I still want to know if it's 3rd and 7 on the Packers opening drive, what 4 are rushing the passer, assuming, because for the most part, Vic 75% of the time is going to rush 4. I know Bryce Huff's going to be there. I know Jalen Carter is going to be there. I assume Josh Sweat's going to be there.
Right.
That 4th guy is either going to be Milton Williams. It could be Brandon Graham moving back inside like he did the Super Bowl year. Maybe they find somebody else, Moro Ojomo, that they're.
Well, if it's not Jordan Davis, and by the way, as we all know, and I've known him for years, and I'm sure Adam's had conversations with him as well. But Vic Fangio is not necessarily warm and fuzzy, and he's going to play the guys that he believes can give him the best production, which most NFL coaches do anyway. So they would love it to be Jordan Davis, but it may not be. You
It
know,
may not be.
Brandon Graham could easily be part of that, and you can move him inside, which we've seen the last couple of years. It could be Moro Ojomo. It could be Milton Williams. I mean, they're going to need to find that fourth guy, Jeff, and I'm not sure until we start seeing the real games that we know exactly who that's going to be. They might know exactly who it's going to be.
Yeah, well, the one guy, and I know it, people are starting to get a little bit concerned, is Nolan Smith, Jeff. Nolan Smith is a guy. He did well against the twos in training camp, not so well against the ones. You can understand Eagles' offensive line's pretty good, but this is another guy you want to contribute. We were expecting him at the start of training camp to be more of a factor. But Greg, I know you saw that.
He was problematic in the games. I was not at camp. You were.
Yeah.
In the games against twos and threes, he just got swallowed up with every pass rush. He was not good at all. And in fact, I was really disappointed watching him because I know he's a great kid. And I know he probably works at it really hard. But, you know, I'm just going to tell you that, which doesn't make me right. Maybe the light switch goes on. Okay. I'm not going to sit here and I'm not going to define his whole career right now. So it could change. But I did not think he was an edge player coming out of Georgia. Okay. And I had conversations with some coaches who believed that he should have made the switch to stack backer right away and that's where he should be. Now, again, that doesn't make any of us right or wrong. We don't know for sure, but he had a really hard time rushing the quarterback in the preseason games. And I watched every one of his snaps.
I remember you saying that not right away and not apples to apples, but if Nolan Smith started his career as a stack backer and you work with him for a few years on learning that position, that he has the athleticism that could make him a Fred Warner type player if he really
took to it. 6'2.5", 6'3", 240. Absolutely. Now, whether that can still happen, I can't answer that. Right. He's now going into his
second year.
Second year. Okay. So again, maybe the light goes on. Maybe they keep working with him. I know he's a great kid and probably very receptive to coaching. But right now, you know, I'm very fortunate that I've gotten the last 2 years to go to the O-Line Masterminds event with Duke Manyweather and Jeff Schwartz and all those guys down in Frisco, Texas. And I've gotten a chance to really talk to O-linemen, which has been really beneficial for me because I don't fancy myself as an offensive line guru by any stretch. But the bottom line is you talk to offensive tackles in particular, and the first thing they say is that the toughest thing to handle is speed to power. If you can't be beaten with speed to power, they feel like they can handle any pass rusher. I remember talking to Andrew Whitworth, who obviously played for 20 years, and he said, eventually they got to get through me. The guys that dance and do all the moves, I'm just waiting for them. They eventually have to get to me. So Nolan Smith right now cannot rush with speed to power. Now, I don't know if that's, I'm not going to sit here and say I know exactly how that's taught. I don't know if that's a technique issue. I don't know if that's viewed as a strength issue. I don't know the answer to that, but he can't do that right now.
Well, you know, we get a lot of emails now and a lot of, ever since he did not have a great preseason showing, should they move him to stack backer? Should they move him to stack backer? And the interesting thing is, Greg, as opposed to last year where they at least practiced him a little bit, we saw that in OTAs and camp. It looks like this year they have exclusively used him as an edge rusher. So that conversation about if he is not a pass rusher, edge rusher, but he is a stack backer is probably not a conversation until spring and summer of 2025.
Right. Now watch him get a sack tomorrow night.
Yeah. I know, right? Or three.
Right. That's going to happen. He'll get a sack tomorrow night. Right.
Well, the one thing on Nolan Smith, though, he did bulk up. You know, he tried. And he's in his mid 240s, but the knock on him is that his frame is still small.
But he's very thin-waisted. Yeah. He's not really he can bulk up a little bit in weight, but he doesn't have that kind of body.
Not a big guy. Yeah, exactly. So this is to play inside backer in this front. We know, Jeff, the group they have a lot of them, but I mean, we may have time to talk about Burks before we get out of here. But the bottom line is, not everyone sold Nolan Smith the same. I know a staff that the staff had a major disagreement with the front office on Nolan Smith. They thought he was too small to be an edge rusher.
Yeah.
The front office loved him. They loved the explosion, but Greg just talked about it. We're not seeing it. That's something to monitor. And again, this is week one. This is the first game.
That's why I said I don't want to define his whole career right now.
Let's see what happens. It's the second year. But Jeff, they need one thing before we move on. Bryce Huff is playing in a new scheme. He's never played anything like this.
But
You and
by
I
the
talked.
way, I thought
Yeah.
he showed some physicality in the
Did he?
preseason. I was
Good.
very impressed with his
Okay.
ability at the point of attack in the run game,
Okay.
which a lot of people didn't know because he was predominantly
Yeah.
a pure pass edge rusher for the
Correct.
Jets. But I thought he showed some physicality at the point of attack.
Okay. Well, Bryce Huff's got to rush the passer. That's
Mhm.
good though. That's part of what
Right.
you evaluate a player. He's got to play the run as well. But he's being paid 17 million a year. He's got to rush the passer. Sweaty, as I mentioned, Jeff earlier, he really struggled late. Like I remember talking to Greg. You and I talked to Greg about it, and you just said he did show up late
He
in the
didn't
season.
look the same.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So, to be honest with you, I know for a fact Graham's tape was really Brandon BG's tape was really good last season, the limited snaps. I'm not so sure right now. Jay Alexander, we have no idea if he'll play at all. But Jeff, I just don't think we know what to expect from this pass rush, quite frankly.
That's my thing is that usually you may question a lot of the Eagles defense, especially on the back end throughout the years.
Yeah.
But usually you don't have this much uncertainty about the pass rush and the front line. So I imagine again that'll be a big topic of discussion tonight on Inside the Birds post game show. So Greg, real quick, but I don't want to turn the page and wrap this all up without talking about the Packers and Jordan Love, and specifically why he works well within Matt LaFleur's play calling system and what to expect formationally from the Packers offense tonight.
Well, there'll be a mix because they'll play 11, they'll play 12. I mean, that's what they do. Matt LaFleur is very much like that. But I think let's talk Jordan Love. First of all, Jordan Love, just in terms of physical traits, because don't forget, being 6'4" and 220 is a trait. Jordan Love is a top 5 quarterback in the NFL in terms of physical traits. And I thought the area in which he improved dramatically last year, and it was very, very evident on tape, okay? And I thought it really, really showed up. He showed as the season progressed much more of a calculated pre-snap understanding, recognizing defenses. That's really important. You know, for people who are on social media, they've heard Tom Brady talk all off season about how important it is to recognize what you're seeing pre-snap. That's critical. And he got so much better at that. I also thought as part of that, he started to use his cadence really, really well to force defenses to declare their intentions. He became a better processor and decision maker from the pocket. And he's capable clearly of making plays outside of structure. So there really isn't anything that Jordan Love can't do. Now, he still needs, I think, to work on mechanics overall. Still has a tendency at times to throw the ball off balance when he doesn't need to, but he's such an easy thrower that at times he gets away with it. But I think that's something that just needs to keep drilling. And occasionally he can be a little reckless. But keep in mind, over the last I'm looking at my notes because I watched a ton of him, and I'm looking at my notes here. Let's see. In the last 8 games, beginning week 11 versus the Chargers, he completed 70.3% of his passes, and he threw 18 touchdowns with only 1 interception. So he obviously was cutting back on the recklessness and undisciplined nature that he sometimes played with. But this gets back to the Eagles' pass rush. If you can pressure him, you're hoping that shows up. But if you can't pressure him, I mean, he's a really gifted player.
Greg, you've used the term comfortable passer. He looks so comfortable.
He's such an easy thrower.
Yep. And quick release. He has a flick every once in a while, kind of like Rodgers, ironically. I thought the kid, you mentioned the Chargers game was the week before the Thanksgiving game. That Thanksgiving game against Detroit, I thought he was elite.
Yeah.
He was, you would know better than I and Jeff, because you're watching tape more than anyone we know. But was there a better quarterback in the second half last season? I thought he was incredible.
He was phenomenal.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. Years ago, I was on with Colin Cowherd, and I was actually out there at the studios, and it was after his next to last year in college, okay? He had a great year. And I told Cowherd, and people can find it. I'm sure, this stuff never goes away, obviously. Mm-hmm. They can also find me saying things where I'm sure I was wrong. But I said that Jordan Love would continue development. He has the look of a top 10, top 5 draft choice. And then, of course, his last year in college, they had a coaching change. He never looked comfortable. And obviously, he was not a top 5, top 10 pick. And he sat for 3 years. But traits-wise, you're dealing with a guy that is without question in the top 5 in the league.
Interesting.
Wow.
Well, that is what the Eagles have to face. Also now for the next, I don't know, hot minute, the highest paid quarterback, right, in the NFL, because he just happens to be the most recently paid quarterback
Right, right, right,
in
right.
the NFL. So that's how it works. All right, great analysis there. We're going to end the show like we've always ended our pregame shows. However, in the past, I've always given you guys a couple of days to think about a score, a prediction, an MVP. This time, I'm just going to put you guys on the spot because you guys are true professionals. So, Adam, I'll start with you. Tell me what the score is going to be and who is going to be the game MVP.
Well, I know the total. The odds makers have it at 49 because you look at the talent level of both teams. But week one is strange. You never know what
Yeah.
you think happens doesn't happen. This should be a high scoring game. Weather's not going to be a factor. But I just don't think it'll be super crisp. It's going to be a fun game. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to go Eagles 20, Packers 24.
Ooh, predicting the Packers win in the week one. You are going to be the bad guy this week on
I
Inside
know
the
I'm
Birds.
going to get hate.
I deliver it to you, although I haven't given my pick yet either. Who's going to be the MVP of the game?
Boy, not that Isaiah Rodgers is like an all-pro, but he's one of their top three outside corners. So I think that's a concern that he's not going to play. Greg mentioned how the personnel groupings, and Matt LaFleur is a really good schemer and designer and play caller. That does worry me a little bit. So I'm going to go with Jordan Love, who Greg just gave a great breakdown on. Jordan Love, I'm a huge fan. He, to me, will be running for the MVP this year. Not just this game as the MVP, but actually the NFL's MVP award. I'm super in on Jordan Love.
All right, sounds good. Greg, I go to you. Who wins the game? What's the score?
I'm going to go with Love as well. I mean, I have to just because, I spent so much time watching it. And I think there's too many concerns about the Eagles defense right now. But having said that, week one is so wacky. I mean, hey, we could be looking at a 10-7 game. Who knows? But I'm going to pick the Packers 30-23. So I guess I'll be hated as well, Jeff.
All right. Well, I'm going to be the nice guy on this platform for the first time, not the first time, but for the rare time. Usually,
You're just a guy that wants to be loved, Jeff. We know.
I do. I need the love, but not Jordan Love. I just need the love of the Inside the Birds fans. I picked the Eagles to win 27-23, and I tell you, I picked Saquon Barkley as the game MVP. I have a feeling that with it not being a true home game, so you do have to deal with the crowd and maybe some silent count, and working in a new center, a new right guard, that Kellen Moore is going to say, let my massive offensive line get this game, get us on the right foot offensively against that Packers front. And I just have a feeling Barkley's going to have a couple of explosive plays that might be the difference. So I'm picking the Eagles to win 27-23 with Saquon Barkley as the MVP. And that's going to do it. The first official Inside the Birds pregame show of 2024 is in the books, and now we leave it out to the Packers and the Eagles to duel it out on the field. We'll catch you all next week. For Greg Cosell and Adam Kaplan, I'm Jeff Mosher. Enjoy your football watching.